welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We were just saying we know this is a tough time of year, summer vacations and different schedules and all that. So really appreciate you all hopping on. Oh, good. Looks like we have a good crowd here today. Today we are talking all about engagement, specifically mapping your stakeholder landscape. My name is Yumiko Doherty. I think I met many of you way back when, it seems like forever ago, during the liftoff launch, the in-person meeting that we had. And I've kind of been waiting in the background for my pillar to come up, which it finally has. Oh, actually, I'm supposed to do these few things first. You are all muted currently, but my hope is that you will eventually come off mute at some point during this conversation. It's a small enough group, so I hope we can really interact with each other today. Also, please, as I'm presenting some information, please go ahead and put any questions, comments in the chat that we'll get to throughout the hour. And then as a reminder, this is being recorded, and the recording is going to go up on the Lift Academy website. So just want to make sure that you're aware of that. As always, hopefully by now you have bookmarked the Lift Academy webpage. That's where we put all kind of upcoming events, resources, etc. So that's where you go to get all your information. The QR code is there. When you go to the site, you will see that it's gotten a facelift. It looks beautiful. So it's got a new look to it. But all the content, all the good stuff is still there. So make sure you visit that often. Again, sorry, my name is Yumiko Doherty. We are launching finally our last pillar of the Lift Academy curriculum, which is intentional inputs. So like I said, I've been kind of hanging out, waiting for my big moment, and here it is. We are launching the last pillar. And I am going to say to you over and over again today, that I really want to drive home the point that even though we're getting to intentional inputs last, it is by no means least, right? It's last but not least. Let me say that. It is absolutely an equal leg on this three-legged stool. And so we're going to really demonstrate, I think, through some real life stories, case studies, et cetera, about why it's so important. I think oftentimes we think of things like community engagement, thinking through your stakeholders, messaging and narrative strategy, all those things. Sometimes we think of them as, oh, those are nice to haves, right? When we have time, we'll get to that eventually. And what we're going to talk about today is, no, these need to be things that are fully integrated into your strategy, that you can have solid funding and well-designed programs and still not make the impact you want, many times because you're not paying attention to that third pillar that's so important. So today, we're going to kick off with a real story that came to us from one of you, from one of our Thor grantees, to kind of illustrate that point. So we'll go through a real life case study, identify kind of 3 common blind spots that stakeholder mapping and community engagement can help address. We'll talk about what is stakeholder mapping, how do you go about mapping your landscape, how do you get started and do this as a team exercise, and then quickly run through all the ways we're here to support you in doing that. So to kick off, a true story, a cautionary tale. And this comes again from one of you, from one of our grantees. So the context here, this came to us from a mountain community organization. They were in the process of designing a shelter and stabilization program in response to a growing crisis in their community, growing homelessness and housing instability. And this project they were calling Bridgehaven. Okay, they really put a lot of thought into the design, wanted to make sure that Bridgehaven reflected best practices, right? So leaning into that program excellence piece, making sure it was low barrier. They thought through things like different safeguards, staffing plan, how were they going to have oversight. So this was not just a quick fix, right? It was a carefully, intentionally built response to a visible and known need in the community. The organization really did their homework, built a great coalition of supporters who were willing to show up, write letters, and advocate for this project. And they had a lot of information, right? All the data explaining the needs of the community and how Bridgehaven was going to help address that need. But before Bridgehaven could move forward, the project had to be approved at a public hearing. So in other words, the community now had a formal opportunity to weigh into this project. And sorry that I'm looking over here. This is where my slides are. So what happened at the hearing? The supporters showed up, right? That great coalition that they had built. The supporters came up and they outnumbered the opponents at the public hearing. But the opposition was organized, they were loud, they were angry. Even though the organization showed up with their data and their information and their best practices, much of the opposition was really leaning into fear-based messaging, right? Stigmatizing language, those types of narratives. So while the supporters outnumbered the opponents, it didn't matter in the end. The proposal ended up being denied and Bridgehaven was never built. So what was the real cost, right? So this organization invested lots of time and resources, right, on planning this project, on coordinating with partners, with supporters. So a lot of time and resources. The shelter doesn't exist, right? It didn't happen, but the need is still there. Likely, the organization's going to have some tough conversations ahead with their funders, with their board about what happened. And so this is a story just as a cautionary tale, again, to drive home the point that community engagement shouldn't be seen as separate from your program design or your funding strategies. It's what is protecting your investment in both, right? So presumably they had the funding, they had the program all designed, and it still failed. So thinking about that third pillar has to be intertwined with your overarching strategy. You're already putting time and effort into program design, into getting those funds. And so engagement is what determines whether it's going to pay off or not. So reflecting on this case study, real quick, what do you think went wrong, right? So the organization did a lot of things right, a lot of the things we've been talking about in the Lift Academy, but what do you think went wrong? Why doesn't Bridgehaven exist today? So put some thoughts in the chat. What do you think went wrong? Would also love to have anyone come off mute and share. Also curious if anyone's experienced something similar to this. They didn't get community champions on board. And we'll talk about that. They had some, right? They had some supporters that showed up. But there were obviously some people they didn't get on board. Let's see, Brian, the organization failed to evaluate the community's taste for such a project. Yeah. Sarah, they didn't get feedback from the community to get in front of the issue. Yep. I think this happens all the time from Allison. Agree with both comments. Great. Yeah. So they did a lot of things right, but there was something, right? They didn't anticipate what was going to happen in that room. Through relationships, through testing out of messages, through getting feedback. Colin didn't properly evaluate some of the resistance that existed in the community. Absolutely. My guess is they were pretty surprised by what they walked into.
Hey, Yumika,
Right?
this is Summer. I'm happy to
Yeah,
jump in. And as
sure.
someone who tries to approach these types of situations with like, what's the worst case scenario?
Mhm.
It sounds like maybe they didn't think through all of those possible scenarios.
Yep, absolutely. So we're going to dive into some of these, right? And kind of give you some tools about how you can more strategically or systematically think through, right? Those different scenarios, test out those message, make those missing relationships work before you get into the room. So keep any comments or questions coming. But what this, I think, case study really helps to reveal, and you all are touching on that, are some common blind spots, right, that can derail even the best designed programs. So the first is undetected resistance, which definitely came through in the comments there, right? So opposition exists right now, right? Whether you know it or not, whether you've identified it or not, or pinpointed or not, right? There are absolutely people out there who have a different opinion, a different perspective, a different worldview on some of the work we are trying to do. So the opposition existed before the organization, before the Bridgehaven group even walked into that room, into the public hearing. It just hadn't been identified yet. And so what we need is a way to surface who might oppose you, right? To Summer's point, who might be there? Can we think 10 steps forward before you get in that room, before you walk into a room that's already stacked against you, right? If we can't identify them ahead of time, we can't be proactive and get ahead of it, right? So undetected resistance is one. Missing relationships. Tanya mentioned this. I think it came through in a few of the comments. Missing relationships. What are the relationships that could have made a difference that hadn't been built yet? So again, in this case, they had a whole group of supporters, right? They had people, they had a coalition, they had a network, right? But likely those are the folks, obviously, that agreed with them, right? Which is kind of an oftentimes a blind spot, right? You work with these 10 partners all the time. We're on the same page. We support each other. But sometimes we don't think, what are all the other relationships that we need to be focusing on building? So what we need is a way to see who's missing from your network, not just who's already in it, right? And how we bring them along. And then finally, and this is what someone said in the chat, failed to evaluate the community's taste for the project, didn't get feedback, right? Unexamined assumptions. So the organization thought that bringing data, showing that they have a well-rounded proposal based in best practices, they thought through some common questions and had answers ready. They thought that would get them through, right? They thought that would carry the day. What they didn't prepare for was folks who, again, were going to really lean into kind of some very different messaging based in fear and stigma. Okay. So, how do we pressure test our assumptions again before getting into that room? So, those are three common blind spots that I think the case study does a really good job of showcasing. So, real quick poll. Which of these three blind spots feels most true for your program right now? Undetected resistance, missing relationships, unexamined assumptions, or maybe all of the above? All right, let's see what we've got here. Can you see the results, Summer? They put, okay, great. So missing relationships, over half of you said that missing relationships felt the most true to you, and then followed by unexamined assumptions. And then one person said all of these are blind spots. Um, Curious about the first one. Why? Any thoughts on why we didn't get any undetected resistance? Or any other reactions to these poll results? Carrie, wow. What are your reactions, Carrie?
Oh, that might be better.
Sorry to call
Uh,
you out. I just, you
No,
wow.
that's okay. Yeah, I don't think that as far as undetected resistance, I think we know where our resistance lies. At least in my community, I'm just like, oh yeah, yep, yep. And we still got to work on those things. But that undetected resistance is also part of those missing relationships.
Uh-huh.
So it's detected resistance that we don't have relationships with those folks. I just thought it
Yeah.
was interesting that those missing relationships were the biggest ones, and probably the hardest to form. I think
Yeah.
most programs are about, or yeah, about those relationships and relationships within the community. And yeah, to bring us all together, connect us all under one roof in some way to get to the same goal. There's just so many ideas about how we get there.
Yeah.
And how do we bring all those ideas together to actually get somewhere together in those missing relationships? So
For sure. For
thanks.
sure. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. And
Sure.
certainly I see the comments, right? Especially in this space. Uh, I think the resistance is very apparent and felt and known in some cases. Brian, good point, right? You have this overarching context of divisiveness, right? That there's always going to be resistance wherever you go. Yeah, Cassie.
Kind of to echo something that Carrie said of missing relationships is sort of the next step of undetected resistance. That's kind
Yeah.
of why I think unexamined assumptions are there as well. Like people know that there is resistance, it is detected, and maybe they're at that point of like, well, we haven't understood it. We haven't tried to, we are making assumptions about it, but we don't have those relationships, and so we haven't quite wrapped our hands around it, but it's detected.
Yes. Yes, detected is a bit different than effectively addressing, right? And so sometimes, in order to actually address the resistance, right, we need the relationships, we need to test assumptions. And to put in a plug, which I'm going to do several times today, our next series is really about how do we form narratives for our most challenging audiences, the folks that have a totally different mental model about homelessness, that have a different worldview, to Brian's point, right, are on the other side of kind of thinking about some of these issues. How do we address them through different types of narratives, different types of messaging that kind of bridges that gap a little bit? So that's coming up in our next series. Once we've detected it, what do we do about it? And how can a narrative strategy help us to get there? Cullen.
Yeah, and I'd also be curious too of like, I think everyone has been in agreement, right, that we all know resistance is going to exist. But I also wonder how much of it is, that organization did a lot of the right things in terms of
Yeah.
developing an evidence-based plan. They really engaged with best practice. They drafted a really comprehensive program. And then at that point, that's when they presented the idea and the concept. And I wonder how much of it is like, how do you start engaging
Mm,
resistance early on, because a lot of it is just you could put in all that work, all that effort, understand
mm.
the local context and best practice. But if you're not engaging people who you know are going to be resistors along the way and sort of make it feel collaborative versus like something that's being done to your community per se, how much of a difference that could make in terms of how you engage people from the onset instead of kind of at the proposal phase when you're presenting the concept for approval or funding or,
Yep.
final blessing later on.
Awesome. It can feel like an afterthought, right? Let me just try to convince you to buy into this proposal that's already baked. It's fully baked. right? That doesn't feel as genuine. Let's talk to people all around. Like it looks like Seth Forwood with Fort Collins Rescue Mission has done, spent 5 years talking to people. So all along, being out there, being proactive, understanding the different perspectives and thoughts. Okay. Well, now that we've talked about some of the blind spots and some of the problems, what is stakeholder mapping and how can it help, right, move us closer to addressing those blind spots? So stakeholder mapping, more of a definition here, right, is a structured way of identifying the people and groups that are connected to your program or initiative. And it helps us get underneath that a little bit more. So it's not just the who, right? Who has a stake in your work, but it's also what do they care about? And how much influence do they have, right? It starts getting more towards that analysis piece. And the goal is to make sure that you see your full landscape more clearly before you start making decisions about how to engage it. Okay, so your stakeholder map is a starting point. It is going to be the foundation for other things to come, right? What relationships do you choose to prioritize? How do you engage? What kind of strategies do you need in place? Your messaging, right? What different audiences need different types of messaging and narratives, right? So the stakeholder map is kind of your initial baseline of seeing the full picture so that you can make more strategic decisions about how to engage, how to message, right, and where to prioritize your time. Here's an example. There's lots of different ways to map stakeholders. And I've put up a few different examples here. I think the power interest grid over on the right-hand side here is the one I've seen the most, right? Your typical 2x2 grid. This is power and interest, but sometimes I see different things on those grid lines, influence, etc. That's a common one. The salience model is just adding some more dimensions to that, right? Where's the power, the urgency, the legitimacy? I've seen a lot of just big spreadsheets, right? Listing all your different stakeholder groups, and then you have different categories you're putting them in. Curious if any of these look familiar to folks. Have you tried some of these techniques before, and how did that go for you? Or is this totally new to you? It could be. I wish I could see the three dots to see if anyone was typing. Allison, the visual one is new to me. So some of these um, Venn diagrams, the three dots are in my brain. I get it. I get it. Yeah. I'm throwing a lot of questions at you.
I feel like I kind of came into this already done with a lot of this set up, and so just maneuvering it, and changing it and changing the dynamics and adding new people and other people exiting. So I didn't really start from a baseline and having to figure all this out. It was just like, here you go.
Oh, interesting. So you inherited something,
Yeah,
and now you need to figure out what it is you're supposed to do with that
yeah.
and how it may be changing. Totally. Right. Yeah. Let's look at some of these comments here. Sarah, at the systems level organization, I've never seen this before. Tanya, we've mapped community members during one of the Lift Academy kickoff breakouts. Yay. So some of you who attended that have had a sneak peek into these. Brian, I've seen the power interest grid before, but in a different context. Yeah, that's a common one. Cullen, what have you done?
Yeah, I've definitely stakeholder mapped a bit before. I think part of the challenge I've experienced is really understanding how to evaluate different stakeholders and their
Yeah.
relative importance or level of impact in terms of resistance, right? Because I
Yeah.
think if you've been in a community a while, like the likelihood that you don't know who a lot of the key stakeholders are is pretty low. But in terms of evaluating, like how much is a stakeholder going to, like, how much is their resistance really going to impact what I'm trying to do? And then
Yep.
making sense of that level of influence in terms of an engagement strategy, I think is where like the secret sauce probably is, but that's also probably the hardest part to really bridge the gap between you have a list of names and you need to do something about it.
Totally. I think that's part of the downside of this, right? We are trying to fit people with a lot of complexity and systems with a lot of complexity into some boxes, right? And somehow rank somewhat abstract concepts like interest or influence. So it's tough. And then to Carrie's point, then what? You put all this work into trying to categorize people, and then what are you supposed to do with it? And especially since it's changing a lot. So we're going to show you a slightly different way to go about stakeholder mapping today, one that's more people-centered. Why? Because this is really about understanding people in your landscape, right? Who they are, what they care about, and how they're connected. We're going to show you, I think, a way that's much more visual so you can actually see different relationships, connections, tensions, etc. That's harder to do, let's say, in a spreadsheet, right? Where you're seeing a list. It's harder to see all those connection points. We're going to look at the full net, try to understand the full network, not just kind of the obvious ones that you list off. And kind of to Cullen's point, right? This is a method where the categories emerge based on your own context. So we're not trying to use abstract categories and fit people in those categories, but rather it's more organic based on your context. And the reason that's important is it can surface, right, different things, informal leaders, right? Connections that wouldn't show up if you were using phrases maybe like power and influence, right? And it makes it easier once you have that full picture to spot who's missing. That's really a big part of what we're trying to get at, is what's not in this picture. So I'm going to show you an example, okay? And I'm just curious to hear what you notice in this type of a stakeholder map compared to what I showed you here, the typical ways that we usually stakeholder map. What do you notice here about this method? Anything that's jumping out at you? And this is a totally different field, by the way. This is healthcare looking at diabetes care. Allison, the interrelatedness. Yep. So you're seeing arrows and lines connecting. Sarah and Cassie, it's messy. Yeah. It's not boxes. It's not a Venn diagram. It's messy. But Cassie says, and it's creative and visual. Yes, thank you. What else is different about this? Or what are you noticing about this? What are some things you didn't see on the previous slide that you're seeing here? Lots of integration, right? You're kind of seeing again some of those arrows, those lines, how do the pieces fit together? Sarah, it's not clear what the next steps are, right? Yes, it is messy, right? So, okay, what do we do with this? That's a good call out. You're lumping stakeholders together, possibly by issue, right? So you see those circles, right? Stakeholders are grouped together, possibly by issue. So they're creating their own categories, separating groups, showing flows. Yes. Message boxes. That's my favorite part. You may notice these kind of little, what are they called? Quotation bubbles coming out of some of the stakeholders. So we'll get at that. Why would you do that, right? It's trying to say in a very concise way what that stakeholder cares about, what their view is. So here's a good example. You have a business manager here, and he's saying, keep the number one market position. that is what that stakeholder cares the most about, right? And so they're depicting that as like a message, a bubble. Okay, so yes, thank you. You noticed a lot of the things that are different about this map. It's about people, right? So this person has literally drawn people, right? This is apparently what the business manager looks like. It is an actual person. It's not just a category. Well, in this case, we did put the role, but you could say Bob, right? The business manager, right? We're talking about real people, not just abstract concepts. You all mentioned grouping in clusters, right? There's those circles that are grouping different stakeholders together in a way that makes sense in this context. So notice we're not talking about power and influence necessarily, but you've got groupings like medical professionals, insurance, manufacturers, regulators, friends and family, right? These are the categories that make sense in this context. There's several of you noticed this, right? There's different arrows with directions, right? How are these different stakeholder groups related to each other? Who's influencing whom? The thought bubbles are quotes. Thank you, Rebecca. What each person cares about, maybe even in their own words. Proximity, how close or distant the person is to your work. You can play around with actual positioning in a map like this. And the messiness, right? It's an honest picture of a complex landscape. It is not a spreadsheet and it's not a list. And it's not even a Venn diagram, right? It's messy because life is messy. So good. You guys picked up on a lot of that. And you might be thinking in your head, who actually does this? So I'm going to show you. This is a map I did maybe 10 years ago. I started a new position. Thank you, Sarah. I started a new position in Colorado in state government. And I think I put this together maybe like after the first month, right? So you know the first month on a new job, you're drinking from a fire hose, you're getting introduced to 100 different people, you're attending seemingly random meetings that all kind of start sounding the same. And this was my way to try to make sense of that, right? To try to not just be a passive consumer of just meeting person after person and going to meetings, but how do I make sense of this? How do I form a more proactive way that I am going to engage with this landscape to push my project forward, right? So yes, as someone said in the chat, there's no clear answers here, right? The map is the starting point, but this is where you start drawing your next steps. So as I'm meeting new people, I can go to my map and say, okay, so they're very much aligned with this group, right? I would definitely put them in this grouping of stakeholders. Or I meet someone else and, I haven't heard that type of messaging in any of these other groups I'm hearing, right? There's obviously another perspective out there that we are missing. So we need to think about who's invited to meetings and ensure we're hearing all the different voices, or it's going to, it's going to get us in the end. Or in this particular case, right, here's a lot of people who are very loud, have a lot of opinions, show up at all the meetings, but the group over here is actually the one with decision-making power. So what do I do about that? And they're not really connected. So it's a way to make sense of these messy landscapes, to put it on paper and really understand what you're noticing, right? Where are the opportunities? Where are the patterns? And where do you need to act? It's a way to give you more agency over your landscape. Any questions or reactions to any of this before we kind of start getting into more of the nitty-gritty of how you do this? Okay. So first things first, how do you start? It's important to determine what it is you're mapping, right? What's at the center that you're mapping around? Because that's really going to determine everything else. And you can kind of come at it at different levels. So in my map, I put me at the center. Obviously, this is me, right? In reality, I was representing a project, right? I had an agenda that I was given. This is what I need to push through, right? So that's what was at the center, is my role pushing my project forward. And these are all the stakeholders who I thought had a stake in that. So what's at the center of your map? It can be different things. It could be a specific project or initiative, right? So Bridgehaven could be at the center of your map. Who has a stake in that particular program or proposal? It could be a specific challenge or a decision that you're wrestling with. Who's relevant to that issue that you're navigating? Or, and especially if you're new to this, it could be your whole program or service area. You just want to get a big picture of the landscape, right? Who's connected in your community to this body of work, more broadly speaking. But match the center of your map to the question that you're trying to answer, right? Are you pushing a particular project forward, or do you just want to get, you don't know where to start? So let's just map our whole service area. Okay, so it's important to start there. What are you mapping? And then it's surprisingly easy, right? The steps to do this. First, write down all the stakeholders. Okay, get a big pad of sticky notes, and it's one person's name per sticky note, and you just write. Okay, don't try to categorize, don't try to filter, right? All the people that are connected to your work. And then this is also where you can start kind of putting side notes, right? Or some of those bubbles around people. And then you start to cluster them, right? Which a lot of you really noticed right off the bat, right? What are the natural categories that are emerging? Start grouping your different stakeholders. And then, right, once you kind of lay out your different groupings, what are the lines and arrows? What are the connection points? And here you want to label your lines, usually with an action item, right? This group influences that group. This group is aligned with this group. This group funds that group. This group greatly opposes that group, right? So what you have to label your connections. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? Literally a word or two that kind of describes what those relationships are. And then optionally, a lot of times in this type of stakeholder mapping, they'll also talk about positioning. So we talked about who's closer to the center, right? Who feels more central to the work, who's more peripheral. So kind of how you organize your stakeholders spatially in your map. I put that as an optional. I think that's a little bit harder to do visually, but that's definitely usually a piece of this. Any questions about this? It sounds easy, right? And so I think if you go back to some of these pictures, you can see that. So it's naming all the stakeholders, grouping all of the stakeholders, and then showing the different connections. Any questions just on a basic level about how to do this? And then we're going to try it. The first step. Before we try it, I do want to give credit. This type of stakeholder mapping doesn't have a clear name, right? We refer to it as people-centered stakeholder map. A lot of this work, though, is rooted in the Luma Institute, which also has some good resources and examples on their website. So definitely want to give credit there. So let's try it. So in the next minute, I want you to just pick your center, right? What would be at the center of your map? Are you focused on a specific project? Is there a big challenge ahead of you? Or are you just mapping your program as a whole? And then in 60 seconds, I want you to just write down as many stakeholders that are connected to that thing as you can. Okay? And this is just to get you flowing on that first step. So think for a minute about what's at the center of your map. And then go for it. Just write down all the stakeholders you can think of in 60 seconds. Go. And stop. How many stakeholders did you all get? If you're comfortable, put in the chat, how many stakeholders were you able to come up with in just 60 seconds? 11, Carrie, good. Not that many, although broad categories. Good, Allison. So try to flip that a bit, right? And even so, if you did get some broad categories, now go down deeper. Who, right? If you were going to reach out to X community partners, who would you reach out to, right? Try to get as particular as you can. And why, right? Why do we want to name names in this? Because if I said something like city council, right, as a category, right, but, right, council member A has a very different viewpoint than council member B, but I'm lumping them together, that makes it difficult to really get into the nuances that you need. Downtown residents, but don't have names. Okay, Carrie, that's a good point, Allison. So downtown residents, but it sounds like that might be a category that you want to explore more, or relationships that you might want to explore more, right? Are there some champions in the downtown residents that you can start identifying as you form relationships? Are there informal leaders or trusted messengers, right? So that might be what you may have identified as a category you need to explore more to get those names. Anybody else? Anyone beat Carrie? More than 11? Okay. Well, I hope that at least got you going, right? It's not difficult to do. I think as some of you were kind of pointing to, right? You live in these landscapes, right? So once you get going, exercise was just meant like it can come pretty quickly. This isn't something you need to do a lot of research on. It's kind of who are the people, right, that you interact with on your project. I strongly suggest, so we did this as an individual exercise. I strongly suggest running this as a team within your organization, right? So if you bring together a diverse group, even just an internal group, right? Including, right, leadership, frontline staff, if you have lived experts who are on staff, people with different perspectives, different roles, the more diverse of a team you can build, the more rich your stakeholder map will be, right? So in Allison's case, they may have a community person who is very plugged in to what's happening downtown and who some of those informal influencers may be, right? So try to bring together a diverse team internally within your organization. Protect some time. So I'm suggesting that you could get a pretty good basic map done in about 60 to 90 minutes, right? You could chunk it out if you needed to, right? You could let's do a big brainstorm of all the different stakeholders and start categorizing them and then come back at another time to really map it out. You want someone who's kind of leading the process within your group. Lots of sticky notes, markers. I suggest poster paper just because then it becomes like a physical thing, right, that you can have. But putting it up on a wall is fine, right? Someplace you can really play around and move around sticky notes and then take a picture afterwards. Really important, silent brainstorm like we just did. Do that first, okay? And then share out with your team, right? Who did you all come up with? Who did we overlap? Who's different? Again, just to pick on Allison's comment there, maybe there's someone else on the team that's like, oh, I came up with 5 downtown residents actually, right? So that's the importance of the diverse team. Everyone's kind of individually coming from their perspective first. The goal is not perfection. It's supposed to be messy. This is just the first step. It's not supposed to be a beautiful final product spreadsheet, right? And if you're thinking to yourself, 90 minutes, she thinks we have 90 minutes to do something like this. Think back to Bridgehaven, right? The story from the beginning. What is the cost of not doing this? Of not taking an hour out with your team to say, let's make sense. Let's map this out so we can better make sense of our landscape and be more proactive with how we address people. So these are just some high-level tips on how to run it as a team. We put together a guide document, a guidance document, a one-pager. Yes, Allison, we will send it out. I think I have a picture on the next slide, but it's a simple one-pager that walks you through step by step. It has a sample agenda, supply list, etc., that tries to make it very easy for you to quickly run as a team. So we will absolutely send that out, Allison, along with the slides in this recording, so you can do that with your teams. And then I do want to get at, someone asked the question or made the statement, right? The stakeholder map doesn't really tell you what to do, right? It doesn't in and of itself tell you what the next steps are, okay? So once you have your map, that's where the magic happens, is in taking a step back as a team and reflecting. So in that one pager, we have a whole list of reflection questions, because it's not a cop-out, but the real true answer is the next steps totally depend on your map, right? It could be as simple as, oh, there's a new nonprofit that opened. We haven't talked with them yet. It seems like they're aligned, but we don't know. I'm going to go have coffee with the director. That could be an easy next step. Or it could be, this opposition group is getting way out of hand. They're putting messages out in the community that's really harming us. We need to sit down and put together a narrative strategy, messaging, like how are we going to counteract this, right? It really depends on what's coming from your map. But here are some good questions to ask of your team, right? Who's missing? Or in Allison's case, we know generally we have this broad category, but we don't know who's in it yet, right? There's something missing there we need to get to. Where are the gaps in our relationships, right? Who haven't we really connected with? Who has influence that we might have underestimated or overlooked? Where do we see that potential resistance? And we haven't engaged with those people yet, right? Folks talked about there's detected residents, but have you actually engaged with those organizations or people yet? Who are those informal leaders, trusted messengers? What assumptions are we making that this map might challenge? And where do we want to focus our energy first? What's the highest priority in here that we're seeing that we want to build? So the map is the first step, right? And the fun part comes in the reflection. Our next series is really focusing on who are your challenging stakeholder groups, your high priority stakeholder groups, and how do we help meet them with a narrative strategy, with messaging, with storytelling, right? To help counteract some of that opposition, potential opposition. So that's a really important one, right? As you do your maps, if you start identifying, ooh, these are some really big sticking points or barriers that we haven't quite known what to do with yet, make sure you attend that next series. We're here to support you. So we will send out the guidance document that gives you a pretty easy step-by-step guide on how to run this exercise with your team. The guidance questions on what to reflect on, what to ask yourselves once you have your map. If you have a TA partner, they are ready and willing to meet with you to help plan and reflect on your maps or help you run a mapping session. So please connect with them. And then we are offering 2 office hour sessions for anyone. I'll be there and a couple other members of our team if you want to come, if you're stuck, if you want to ask questions, if you want to reflect on your map together. Whatever it is, it's an open office hours. So come join us. The times are there. And then we're going to end this series with a hands-on workshop. I think it's always helpful once you've got your initial plan to have some fresh eyes on it. And also to compare, right? Like, oh, you included downtown residents. I didn't even think of that on our map, right? That was a total blind spot I didn't think about. So we'll kind of have a hands-on workshop where you can share, talk about, validate your maps and really hone in on what your priorities are going into that next series. And that will be on July 30th. Before we end, and we always want to leave some time at the end of our sessions for you to fill out the poll or the survey on how we did. What are your questions? Reactions, concerns? Any challenges? Is this really worth my time? Okay. Oh, Allison. Yeah, it's never too late, right? Same here. 2 years ago, and I just want to say, I don't know if I really made this point too. These are always changing, right? These maps. People are going to leave, positions are going to change, new groups come into being, right? So it's not a one-shot thing, right? It's an evolving piece. Okay, well, Allison, come to office hours or work with your TA partner. Well, we'd love to kind of talk you through this and how we can help Loveland. Okay, tell us how we did, please. Here is a QR code for our SurveyMonkey evaluation. I'm also going to pull up. I'm going to pull up the survey right now in Zoom if you want to take it now. But we'd love to hear your reactions to the session, just so we can keep getting better and keep being responsive to what you're most interested in. So if you could take a few minutes, and if you do complete the poll, remember you have a chance to win a $5 gift card. Okay, and as we're closing out, folks are filling out that very quick poll for us. Just a few reminders, next steps up on the screen here. QR code again to the Lift Academy webpage. This is where you'll see the recording, the slides, other resources up, and also kind of the upcoming schedule, office hours, the next session, etc. Please give this a try over the next couple weeks if you can, prior to that workshop, right? Try to run this as a team. We'll make sure the guidance document gets out there. Check in with your TA partners. If applicable, come to office hours, and then remember that hands-on workshop is going to be on July 30th. Lift team, what else am I missing? Anything else we need for closeout?
No, but I think thanks Yumiko for facilitating such an engaging session for sure. Some of the stuff I wish I had learned a while ago. So
Same.
it was really helpful.
Same. Cool. Well, we'll hang out here for another few minutes if any questions or comments come up. Thank you to those who are filling out the poll. Yeah. And I'm glad you all were able to join us. Thanks for your engagement.